Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So we're wrapping up our series on principles of Islamic jurisprudence. And you know, when we started off, we said that the goal of this series was sort of to get a better understanding of the principles that are used to derive Islamic law. So do you think we were successful in that?
Yes, I think we have described basically the main principles and some subsidiary principles, the main principles being the Quran, the Sunnah, Ijma' and Qiyas, and we talked briefly about Ijtihad. We also showed how there are subsidiary principles like the customs of the land, or aada as they say in Arabic, the search for beauty, istihsan, and human welfare, masalih of people. And we saw in a comprehensive way how Islamic law is basically derived. People may have just a simplistic idea that everything in Islamic law must come directly from the Quran, and we have seen that it's not really so.
And particularly with the series, we also, I think you had said at one point, you also want to sort of showcase how you yourself come up with sort of some of the answers, because you do get questions from our viewers on sort of Islamic rulings.
Yes, well, what we have tried to achieve with this, and of course some of this requires more elaboration, you know, as specific subsets of the larger topic. What I've tried to achieve is to show that Islamic law is not as clear-cut as people may think. It's not something carved in stone, once and for all given, and this is forever the case. Because if God had said something and God said that this is going to be forever the case, well then of course our hands are tied. This is the legislation for all time. But what we have seen is that human elements were at play in deriving and describing what is going to be Islamic law, and in specific times and circumstances, Muslim scholars try to understand the Quran and they try to understand the prophetic example and applied these rulings either from the Quran or from the prophetic Sunnah to their time and place and circumstance, and that's where the whole idea of chaos came in. They had to use analogy and see, okay, this is like that. This was not specifically spoken about, but by analogy we can see that a similar rule applies. But then that requires some human judgment to know what exactly is similar to the other thing. We have seen that whereas there is often a claim of ijma' or consensus on something, often there is no such real consensus, at least not by explicit declaration. The most one might say is that there is a tacit sort of acceptance by a large majority of scholars, or maybe that we see that something is said and nobody seems to object to it, so we take it for granted that it must be okay, because nobody seems to be voicing a complaint against this. So we see that there is a human process by which the Islamic law is derived, and it is the same human process that we need to apply in our current times, and often there is a stark refusal in contemporary scholarship to really revisit that whole process and ask, well, how can we apply the original principles, but in a changing circumstance. So
just out of curiosity, if there is, we agree that this is the process that everyone follows, right? So why is it then that there's room for, on a particular issue, why does one scholar give one opinion and why does another scholar give one opinion? How do you explain that?
Well, this is a human element that we spoke about. First of all, if we come to the Quran requires some interpretation. Not everything jumps out at you and hits you on the head with a hammer. You look at the text and you say, okay, this text means X, but some other scholar looks at the same text and says this means Y. And we look at the prophetic example and we see that maybe the Prophet, peace be upon him, did something that was peculiar to his time and circumstance. He didn't mean for this to be a universal rule. And some people took it to be a universal rule, but some scholars may look at it and say, no, this is not meant to be a universal rule. It was something the Prophet, peace be upon him, did by virtue of the time and place in which he lived. And in a different circumstance, we can actually arrive at a different rule. These are the human elements of interpretation that are brought to the classical sources of Islamic law.
Are there any areas that you think as a community or the scholarship needs to focus more on when we're thinking about these principles?
Well, very broadly, we see that within the last 40 years or so, life has actually transformed to a much a greater extent than within, let's say, the 40 years before it. And in fact, things have happened within the last 40 years that were unimaginable to our classical scholarship. So the rulings that were given, say, 1,400 years ago, 1,200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, can hardly fit some of the new situations that we're looking at.
What are some examples?
Let's say, for example, test tube babies. There are now some 7 million people in the world who actually are the result of in vitro fertilization. And this was unimaginable at one time. The most scholars will do at this time is to say, well, okay, let's try to see how classical law applies to this. And they will say, okay, if the sperm and egg both come from husband and wife, well then that seems okay. But you cannot have a situation where the sperm and egg come from two persons who are not married to each other. So here is where classical Islamic law is being applied to a wholly new situation. And with this example, we see that, okay, there's a neat fit, there's an easy way to transition, but there are some cases where we're really dealing with such new phenomena, like stem cell research, for example, that require fresh thinking. It requires scholars to be steeped in the Quranic knowledge, very familiar with the life example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and to use all of that knowledge in a nutshell to make it apply to the current and changing circumstances.
Well, obviously that's applicable to scholarship, right? And that's something that they're focusing on. But for the average viewer who took part in the series with us, what are you hoping they take away from this?
Well, I hope that they will see how dynamic is this act of trying to derive the Islamic law, and how differentiated it will be from one person to another. We've seen that, for example, between Imam Malik and Imam Shafi, both great scholars, there are different approaches to Islamic law, with Imam Malik stressing the actions of the people of Medina as a basis for his rulings, and Imam Shafi stressing the importance of following the hadith. We have seen, perhaps we didn't stress this enough, that the Hanafi scholars, on the other hand, in Iraq, they largely went with a well-defined and logical deduction over and above some of the transmissions of reported sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, at the time, because the logical deduction to them in some cases were more reliable than the transmitted narrations, which people can make a mistake in transmitting.
And what do you hope our non-Muslim viewers take away from this series? Because obviously it sounds, to them, I'm sure it's like quite complicated.
Well, I hope non-Muslim viewers can see that despite this complexity, that, well, this is the very point of it, that it is a complex phenomenon. It's not just a simple black and white that, okay, this is Islamic law. So, especially in the United States of America right now, there are anti-Sharia movements where people think they have to oppose Sharia, and this is their duty to do so. And what they think that they're opposing is a classical formulation of Islamic law. What they need to understand is Sharia is more broad than this. It is the achievement of certain elements of justice and fairness in society, and these elements of justice and fairness were achieved in a particular way in a given circumstance some hundreds of years ago. But in our present circumstance, to achieve the same things, we might have a different formulation of Islamic law. And in fact, even Muslims need to understand this. Some Muslims themselves think that in order to apply what we will call Sharia today, whether in America or anywhere else, it will have to be a reproduction of what was done by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, some 1,400 years ago. But what this series has demonstrated is, I hope, is that it's not the specifics that are so important to replicate, but it is the objectives, the main purposes like justice and fairness in society that need to be achieved. And often this is achieved in contemporary law in many modern democratic and free societies. That is largely Islamic law to begin with. So if people are opposed to Sharia, then they must be opposed to some of their own democratic laws as well. But they don't understand. They think that Sharia must be something entirely different.
If you want more of Let the Quran Speak, you can watch previous episodes or new ones by subscribing to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/QuranSpeaks. Stay updated by liking us on Facebook and following us on Twitter @Quran_speaks. And when you're on the go, listen to our podcast at QuranSpeaks.com.